My name is Heidi VanGenderen, and I have the privilege of serving as the University of Colorado Boulder's Chief Sustainability Officer. I've had a long career in working to advance the policies, technologies, deployment, and financing of low-carbon strategies, and it's my equal honor to be a moderator of this afternoon's panel. For the recording purposes of the Conference on World Affairs, today is Friday, April 14th, 2023. It is 3-something p.m. And the title of this panel is Enacting Climate Solutions Through Human Rights Commitments, Climate Commitments, Right Here, Right Now, Boulder Impact Forum. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that Boulder is on the ancestral homelands and unceded territory of indigenous peoples who have traversed, lived, and stewarded lands in the Boulder Valley since time immemorial. Those indigenous nations include the Apache, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, Pawnee, Shoshone, Sioux, and Ute. One other thing I'd like to mention before we get going on the panel is that we want to make sure this robust audience has a chance to ask questions this afternoon. And this is how we're going to handle Q&A. We will reserve the end of the discussion for that question and answer period. We're using a note card system to receive questions from you, the audience. At any time in the session, please just raise your hand, and one stalwart CWA volunteer will come by and give you that note card. If you would please write legibly, and if you are a student, please make specific note of that if you would, so that we can call you out on that. And when you are finished and ready to submit your question, just raise your hand again, and that perhaps another stalwart volunteer will come by and retrieve that from you. I'd now like to do a brief introduction of each of our panelists, but I would commend you to the CWA website, which has a much more thorough introduction for each of them. And as I heard a panel moderator say yesterday, and if those don't suffice for you, go to Dr. Google, and you might learn all that you really want to know. Jim, and this is going to be a test to, because we're not in any particular order up here, in the introductions I'm going to do, we're going to start with Jim Anaya, who serves as a distinguished professor and the Nicholas Stoneman Professor of International Law at the University of Colorado Law School. Jim has taught and written extensively on international human rights and issues concerning indigenous people, which distinctly suited him to serve as the lead co-chair for the recently convened Right Here, Right Now Global Climate Summit, which this university was privileged to co-host with the United Nations Office of the High Commission on Human Rights. Among Jim's many accolades and calls to service, he was recently appointed by President Biden to serve on the National Board of Education Sciences. Benjamin Schachter, to Jim's left, is a human rights officer and the lead point for climate change and the environment at the Office of the United Nations High Commission of Human Rights. He lives and works in Geneva, Switzerland, and may get the prize for the furthest traveler. A lawyer by training, Ben had the good fortune to know Jim Anaya at the University of Arizona, where Ben served as a research assistant to, I hope I got this right, to Jim, who was then the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous People. Ben is currently on leave and has been kind to have a slight digression to join us here in Boulder. Congressman Neguse is going to be arriving shortly, and I'm going to go ahead and introduce him and let you know that he will also need to leave today because he is a member of the United States Congress, and when you're in your home district, you are kept to a very full schedule. He'll be leaving us at 4 o'clock, but when we'll see him when he arrives. Congressman Neguse is in his third term as a member of the United States House of Representatives, serving Colorado's 2nd Congressional District. That's here, for those of you who may not be familiar with congressional maps, all to our good fortune. Among his many distinctions, Congressman Neguse started his path down service in elected office as a member of the the Board of Regents for this university system, and I learned today that he was also an intern with the city of Boulder in his youth. A quick point of personal privilege. My husband and I had the unexpected pleasure of meeting Joe's dad when we were all leaving a CU football game. I took the liberty of telling his dad that it was my personal hope that his son would become the first Colorado occupant of the White House. Let's hear it. Will Toor, all the way to the left in the bright pink shirt, is currently the executive director of the Colorado Energy Office. Like the congressman, Will is well known to most of this audience for his many roles of service that includes a stint as this university's the director of this university's environmental center, and his stalwart championship of all things sustainable. For those who may not know, Will is also a mountain climber who ran into a spot of trouble with his fellow climber and wife, Mariella, last year. We are incredibly glad that Will and Mariella survived what they did and know that it's probably futile, as our next panelist knows more than many, to ask Will to consider tempering his daring going forward. And there he is. Welcome, Congressman. No worries.
Hi.
No worries. Good to see you. And on to the panelist I just referenced. Jonathan Koehn, in addition to being a close outdoors buddy of Will Toor, has been a vital leader in the city of Boulder's premier leadership in addressing climate change since 2006. Jonathan has held several roles within this city and recently was so deservedly appointed as the director of the city's Climate Initiatives Department, where he and his team are responsible for implementing the city's sustainability agenda. CU is fortunate to also have Jonathan as a faculty member of the terrific Masters of the Environment program here, where he is able to both convey his considerable storehouse of subject expertise, but as importantly, convey and demonstrate what leadership is. Last but not least, Kathryn Wendell, who joins me in representing that nearly always underrepresented segment of the society. We're both women. With over 2 decades of experience leading global social impact and sustainability programs in the public, private, and education sectors, Kathryn is currently serving as the executive director of the Center for Ethics and Social Responsibility at the CU Boulder's Leeds School of Business. Kathryn was an enormous contributor on the faculty-led steering committee for the Right Here, Right Now Global Climate Summit, and in addition to being a mom, an able educator, and just a genuinely lovely person, she is an adventurer who has visited over 80 countries around the world. Please join me in welcoming this distinguished panel. Please ask Joe and Jonathan and Jim to move forward a bit into the light. That's a pretty class. There you go. That's a pretty classy metaphor, I would say, for the topic at hand, wouldn't you?
That's good.
Shall we agree? We need to walk into the light. To start the panel, we will hear, some opening observations from each of our panelists and traverse the global to local to examine the obligations, responsibilities, and opportunities held by the key sectors of our society: the public sector, the private sector, and the roles of academia and civil society. So to start us off, Jim and Anaya, the framing of the climate crisis as a human rights crisis was central to the Right Here, Right Now Global Climate Summit held on this campus in December of last year, with over 4,000 registrants and 99 countries tapped into that summit. Could you please help frame today's discussion by telling us more about the mission and outcomes of that summit?
Thank you, Heidi. Can you hear me? Is this on? Gotta get really close to it. Thank you, Heidi. It's a real pleasure to be on this distinguished panel with people who I know have a lot to share about this important topic. The Right Here, Right Now Global Climate Summit was organized to highlight the human rights crisis that climate change is. Climate change is not just some far-off issue that isn't with us now. It's not just a matter of soft policy of some type. It is a crisis that is happening now and affecting the human rights of real people today, including people in Boulder County who suffered the effects of a wildfire a year and a half ago. Vulnerable people in vulnerable situations, indigenous peoples, others are finding themselves without the basic sustenance needs, are finding their sea levels in island countries, people in island countries, the sea levels rising, threatening the very existence of the countries they live in. Indigenous peoples in the Arctic are seeing the sea ice melt at a rate that is threatening the survival, their very survival, because their dependence on the natural resources that rely on the sea ice and the permafrost that is kept intact by the lower temperatures. And so the climate summit that we organized in partnership with the Right Here, Right Now Global Climate Initiative and UN Human Rights was to highlight this human rights crisis that climate change is. And it was organized around the framework that has developed since World War II around the idea of human rights and around the idea of obligations that states and others have to address human rights problems. This framework begins with the proposition that everybody, everywhere, is entitled to basic human rights, beginning with the right to life, to physical security, to health, to development, and other fundamental rights that we all really find self-evident, that are self-evident to us. And secondly, within this framework is the proposition that states, and the acceptance of this proposition by governments around the world, that they have the legal obligation to protect these rights, not just to avoid infringing them, that is, respect them, but to protect these rights in an affirmative way. And then thirdly, is within this framework is the proposition that when rights are violated or threatened with violation, these duty bearers, states and others, have the obligation to provide remedies or look for solutions or help advance solutions. And so the Climate Summit was organized around this framework. First, examining the human rights impacts of climate change, the impacts on fundamental human rights of the changing climate, rights to life, rights to health, and the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, a human right that was recognized by the UN General Assembly just last year. And secondly, it was organized around the concept of obligations and responsibilities, looking at the obligations that governments had, as I said, to protect human rights, and specifically in the context of climate change. And the duties that others, or the responsibilities of others in powerful situations that they have, so particularly business enterprises that are in large part, have contributed to this climate crisis. And so that was part of the summit as well, examining the responsibilities of business enterprises along with the obligations of states. And then finally, the third day of the climate summit was organized around solutions. And highlighting the solutions were the views of youth, among others. It was very important. So we had these wonderful panels in these 3 days, highly diverse group of people coming to Boulder from around the world, from backgrounds of all kinds, from experts to activists, youth to elders with wisdom acquired over decades, joining in this conversation, talking about the impacts in their lives, in the lives of their communities of climate change, the impacts on their human rights and the human rights of their communities, examining the responsibilities and obligations that states and business enterprises and others have, and then talking about solutions. And let me just end by saying that one of the key components of the discussion was on the responsibilities of educational institutions in advancing solutions to climate change. And of course, because we're at a university and CU sees itself as having a role in advancing solutions to climate change, that is a very important part of the summit. And I'll probably say something more later on in the discussion about the role that educational institutions and that we at CU can have and better fulfill in advancing solutions to the climate crisis. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks, Jim. Ben, over to you. Could you tell us, please, about the United Nations, its climate commitments, and its role in the fabric and sectors in advancing effective climate actions?
Yes, thank you very much, and welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here on behalf of the United Nations Human Rights Office, where I coordinate our work on the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Jim's, I think, covered well the summit and some of the basic human rights obligations which apply in the context of climate change. But I do want to say a few more words about that, and also I think I should perhaps introduce UN human rights in our mandate for those of you who might not be familiar with us. We have an independent mandate to monitor, promote, and protect human rights across the world and to mainstream human rights throughout the United Nations system. We are supporting the Human Rights Council, which is the principal intergovernmental organ for advancing human rights within the multilateral system, as well as the human rights treaty bodies, which are the mechanisms which have been established under human rights treaties. They're composed of committees of experts to support their implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. So in that capacity, we do a great deal of work on climate change that is mandated by the international system. The Human Rights Council has, over the past 15 or more years, had an almost annual resolution on human rights and climate change, mandating us to produce reports looking at the impacts of climate change on a variety of groups of people and rights. And this work has all fed into and informed the Right Here, Right Now Global Climate Alliance and the Global Climate Summit, which we were so pleased to co-host with the University of Colorado Boulder. The human rights treaty bodies have clearly found that climate change is a human rights issue. So has the Human Rights Council. So have the world's best scientists working on climate change, who've found that rights-based approaches lead to more effective and better and sustainable climate action. In their most recent assessment report of the climate change situation. So all of this is really part of a big and important puzzle that we're trying to solve. And we are badly failing at solving because we've known that climate change harms people, affects their rights, and is getting worse and worse for decades. And we simply have not done anything meaningful to stop it. Emissions keep rising year after year after year. And that is the grossest human rights violation that one can imagine. The impacts right now are hunger, water scarcity, displacement, death. These are all human rights violations that are happening on a massive scale, bigger than any other single cause of human rights harm that you can imagine, is inaction to stop climate change. And that's why we think this work, developing the human rights climate commitments, can be so important and powerful because it helps shift the narrative. It helps change the discussion from one of, abstract policy to one of actual human suffering with legally binding obligations attached. So all states have a legally binding obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. And that includes stopping climate change, preventing the harms it's causing, and remedying them when prevention isn't possible. States are the primary duty bearer, but as Jim introduced already, businesses have a responsibility to respect human rights. Educational institutions, foundations, and other entities all have a responsibility to respect human rights. UN Human Rights itself shares this responsibility. And of course, it's the core and heart of our mandate. The human rights climate commitments are an effort to take human rights obligations, which we have been talking about in the abstract for, as I said, more than 15 years, and try to distill them into concrete, actionable commitments that duty bearers can and must take in order to minimize the scope of the ongoing human rights crisis. And they're informed by this large body of work of human rights mechanisms, by the Right Here, Right Now Global Climate Summit. They're meant to be an iterative text and drafting process, one that will be validated through a series of consultations, which have already begun. And we're really excited to get to work in terms of finalizing, or as I said, not really finalizing, because as I said, it's iterative, but get to work to continue this process of helping duty bearers who have human rights obligations and responsibilities understand what they have to do under international human rights law to address this human rights crisis that is climate change. So I'll stop there for now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ben. Look forward to following up on how the accountability mechanism is built into what you've described as well. We are moving from the international down to 3 levels of government here in the United States that are represented with us here today. We'll start at the federal level with Congressman Neguse, move to Mr. Toor at the state level, and then to the local level with Mr. Koehn. And gentlemen, look forward to hearing about the commitments and actions at your respective levels. Welcome.
Sure. Can you hear me okay? Is that better? Yeah, okay, great. Well, good afternoon, and it's good to be here, and my apologies for being a little bit late. But what a wonderful opportunity to be able to speak with folks who I trust are deeply invested in this topic, as we all are on the panel. I also think it's quite fitting that this is the last, I believe, the last session on the last day of the Conference on World Affairs, because I suspect many of you who've been participating the last couple of days are reflecting on what you've learned and thinking about the future. And there's no issue more important for our collective future and for the future of humanity than the existential threat posed by climate change. We do have obligations. We have obligations, of course, as a federal government to our own citizens and to humanity to do everything we can to save this one incredible planet that we share. I would say that prior to about 2 years ago, much of what was happening at the federal level was very dispiriting. I don't know that the federal government was meeting its obligations, and that's probably the understatement of the day. And the best crystallization, perhaps, most salient crystallization of that was sort of at its apex, the United States exiting the Paris Climate Accords a mere less than that, 4 years ago. I think about that in the context of the developments in the last 2 years. And I think there has been no more exciting time at the federal level to reflect on the actions that we've taken in the fight against climate change and the opportunities that exist moving forward prospectively. Most of what we have done for the better part of the last decade has been at the subnational level, and you'll hear from some really talented people at the state and at the local level who have been taking steps to push this renewable energy drive into our future. But in the last 2 years, the federal government has finally stepped forward, at least, and begun to meet some of its obligation. Perhaps the best example of this is the Inflation Reduction Act, which I know many of you, I suspect, how many of you are familiar by show of hands with the Inflation Reduction Act? So even in this very well-informed group of citizens from across our country, only about half are familiar with the Inflation Reduction Act, which is fascinating for me and tells me that we've got more work to do, I think, in conveying to the citizens across our country the significant climate action that was taken at the federal level to address this catastrophic crisis that we're all working to overcome. The Inflation Reduction Act included the most significant investments in the fight against climate change in the history of the United States. I traveled, I guess this was 2 years ago now, to Scotland for the COP25, right? Because COP26 was COP26, gosh, okay, because the COP27 was in Egypt, which I missed. So COP26 in Scotland, less than 2 years ago, with the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. I served on that committee before it was eliminated, unfortunately, in this last Congress. And in our visits there in Scotland, I remember distinctly every single individual we met with talking to us about the many investments that they hoped the United States would make to show global leadership in the fight against climate change. We ultimately met that challenge in the bill that we passed a little under a year ago, and it's now being implemented, and there are billions of dollars, $27 billion, just to give you an example, for state and local governments and tribal governments to be able to help invest in renewable energy development here in our country. Billions of dollars to improve and enhance our grid, investments on the transmission side to get more renewable energy online, investments in rebate programs to help electrify more of our economy so that homeowners and residents here in Colorado and across our country are able to participate in that renewable energy transformation. So the bill, I think, is going to have a real impact. It may not feel that way today as it's beginning to be implemented, but suffice to say that I think it's a harbinger for things to come. The challenge now for us as federal, I say federal policymakers, but really the federal government writ at large, I think, is what's next, right? Is where we go from here. For decades, I suspect some of you in the audience have been beating the drum, making the case that the federal government needed to make this generational investment to really kind of be the moonshot to get us into this renewable energy future that we all know is so desperately necessary. We are now there with those investments, and the question is where we go from here, and I think that's a question that every single citizen is going to have to be involved in answering. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Will?
How about now? Oh, you do have to be close. So, to bring it down to the state level, I joined the Polis administration on January 18, 2019, about 4 days after Governor Polis took office. And since then, it's just been an incredibly exciting time to be working on clean energy and climate action in Colorado. I would argue that Colorado is perhaps the most exciting state in the country right now when it comes to clean energy policy. During the 2019 legislative session, our legislature for the first time adopted science-based greenhouse gas emissions targets of a 50% reduction by 2030, a 90% reduction by 2050, gave direction to state agencies to pursue an all-of-government approach on climate change, and then delegated authority to our State Air Quality Control Commission to enact regulatory actions to make progress towards those targets. Our office, the Colorado Energy Office, then convened a sort of multi-agency process with stakeholders and residents across the state to develop a greenhouse gas roadmap that's essentially the strategic plan for how are we going to achieve those targets. And then I worked with the legislature to take the results of that roadmap and implement the legislation that was necessary to take it from a map to actual action. Over the last 4 years, depending exactly how you count, I think there have been 55 different pieces of legislation that have moved forward on greenhouse gases, energy efficiency, renewable energy, oil and gas reform, transportation electrification, building efficiency, and land use efficiency, all of which contribute to achieving these goals. I would say that the central near-term strategy is really around decarbonizing the electric system, right? Now, Colorado has historically been very heavy on coal. A few years ago, well over 50% of our electricity came from coal. And the availability of low-cost renewables has really allowed a remarkable transformation, really driven by the fact that it costs 4 to 4.5 cents a kilowatt hour just to operate and maintain existing coal plants. And you can replace it with wind or solar for 2 to 3 cents per kilowatt hour. That has really enabled remarkable change. And we are now on a pathway where by the end of this decade, every coal plant in Colorado will be retired. Our largest utility, Xcel Energy, will have approximately an 80% renewable grid. And across the state, we'll see about an 85% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from the electricity sector. The next sort of major piece to the strategy is using that clean electricity and leveraging it to electrify other sectors. Transportation is our single largest source of greenhouse gas pollution, and there is simply no pathway to achieving our emissions goals that doesn't involve widespread electrification of transportation. Colorado has been sort of vaulting up. We're now fifth in the country in terms of electric vehicle market share. We were at about 2% of new vehicle sales 4 years ago. We're up at about 10.5% as the end of last year. And we've just adopted goals of reaching about 60% market share by the end of the decade, 80% by 2032, and we'll be moving through a regulatory process later this year to enshrine those goals into law for the auto manufacturers. We also need to electrify other sectors, and I think two of the sort of major challenges that are out there, because they're harder sectors to work with, are electrifying buildings and decarbonizing the industrial sector through a variety of strategies, including electrification and thermal storage. Those are things that are getting an enormous boost due to the actions of the federal government. And I'm looking forward to later this year using $140 million from the Inflation Reduction Act to stand up a rebate program to support low and moderate income residents in energy efficiency and electrification. And the way that we've modeled it, we think that when it comes to the sort of federal investments coming out of the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, that with appropriate state policy over the next decade, we should be able to leverage close to $20 billion of federal investment statewide that would primarily come to individual residents and the private sector, a small part of it coming through government, that would put us on a climate-aligned pathway. So just a few years ago, I tended to be pretty pessimistic about could we actually get this done? But just seeing the progress over the last few years, I'm a lot more optimistic than I've ever been.
Fine, note 10 on Jonathan.
Great. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. So as Heidi introduced me, my name's Jonathan Koehn, and I am deeply honored to serve the Boulder community as the director of the Climate Initiatives Department. I'm going to donate just a couple moments of my precious time to thank my panelists up here. I really see all of you as true champions in dealing with the climate crisis, and I'm really humbled to be up here with you. That includes you too, Heidi, by the way. I also want to thank the Conference of World Affairs for creating this platform for this really important discussion. I really hope that all of you have been able to see some of the great speakers over the last couple of days. And I actually want to thank all of you for taking the time to sit and listen to these conversations. It's important that you're here. So I wanted to, I guess, start by saying that I don't intend to talk about all of our actual projects and programs that are in flight. I don't know that it would necessarily be all that useful. But I do want to offer a couple of comments around some of the learnings at the local level and how it connects into some of the comments that the congressman made and then, of course, Will from the state level. So, this community in Boulder obviously has prioritized environmental issues and sustainability for a very, very long time. And over the past couple of years, I think we've recognized that even in a place like Boulder, who has mature programs and has a dedicated funding program through our climate tax, the current approach is largely insufficient to match the speed and scale of what science is telling us we need to do. So because Heidi, you asked about commitments. Much of our work in Boulder is backstopped by our goals to reduce emissions 70% by 2030, become a net zero city by 2035, carbon positive by 2040. We also have a goal of getting to 100% renewable electricity by 2030 with some local generation targets kind of embedded in that. So, I generally see climate-related commitments and pledges at the local level a very good thing. But I also want to just point out that they often lack the recognition of the importance of the scale of action that's necessary. And we also have to recognize that there are limits to cities' ability to control crucial factors. Give you an example, carbon intensity of our electricity supply. That's not something that cities generally control. So it forces us to work more comfortably outside our boundaries, forces us to go to the state legislature and advocate for changes in rules. It forces us to go to the regulatory agencies. Not every city is comfortable doing that. And so that's just one of the issues that I think we're forced into thinking about in terms of reimagining the work we do at the local level. I will also say that we get into this tangled discussion about what counts. And how important is it to hit 100% of these goals? Is 95% good enough? Is it hard and expensive to get that last 5%? Is it worth it? So these are the conversations that cities are starting to have about these types of pledges. And I'm just going to say that while these types of goals, I think, invoke the inner math geek in all of us, by attempting to frame climate change as a math problem, I think it creates a bit of a perverse consequence that by focusing on measurable quantities, we devalue the things that can't be measured or that are harder to measure. So let me give you an example: biodiversity, or loss of biodiversity, or things like the sacredness of our land. And we can't really see things like social injustices or economic inequalities really show up in that way. And so under the regime of carbon accounting, I think it becomes more of a secondary importance. And I just want us to be clear that those are one of the challenges that local jurisdictions are facing. I'm not saying that that emissions don't matter, nor am I saying that pledges don't matter, but I think we need to understand that emissions reduction alone is not sufficient, or it's insufficient in addressing the climate emergency. So here locally, we've really calibrated our work to focus on 3 thematic areas: energy systems, circular economies, and nature-based climate solutions. And within each of those, we really recognize the role of the individual, how that contributes to collective action, and then what are the systems that we need to be changing at the highest level. And there's way too much to unpack today in each of those areas, but obviously there's a lot going on. We also prioritize other systems that I think we cannot fail to talk about, and those are our economic systems. And then it's looking at our legal systems, for example, through our efforts like our climate lawsuit against some of the climate majors, ExxonMobil and Suncor. More importantly, though, I think we all need to realize that every year scientific reports are telling us what we are all seeing firsthand, and that is that climate disruption is not looming in some imaginary future. It is here and now, and that's a justifiably frightening thing. So we have centered our action here locally around 2 central pillars, and I want to talk about them just very briefly: climate resilience and climate justice. You've heard those terms thrown around a lot over the last couple of days, as they should be. But there's a connection between those 2 as well. What I mean is that true resilience really requires us to go beyond treating the symptoms of inequality and really look at the structures that produce it. So like most communities, we're working really hard to think critically about how we're responding to the effects of a changing climate. Things like climate-driven disasters, wildfires, floods, extreme heat, desertification of our agricultural lands, and social resilience. How do we identify existing and future threats, and how do we protect those most vulnerable among us? So I'm going to conclude a little bit here and say that I know we have all heard that saying that the people who are least responsible for climate change are the most affected by it. And I got to say, I personally struggle to find the appropriate language to describe that and what it means to me. But I just keep ending up in, that is wrong. It is simply morally wrong. So climate change is and will be an engine of global inequality. And the fact is, folks, richer people and countries are going to buy their way out of this first. And unfortunately, they're going to use the wealth accumulated by burning fossil fuels in many instances. So that's why it's been so welcome to partner with the UN and the Right Here, Right Now Alliance to really emphasize the nature and importance of this social justice issue. So I am precariously close to going on a tangent, so I'm going to conclude by saying that I'm really important to the work that's going on at the local level. I'm really incredibly proud of all of you and the work that's going on in our neighborhoods, at the local level, and really connecting to the important values that we have as a community. Thanks.
Indeed, when Joe Neguse is running for the White House, Jonathan can step into his. Last, but again, not least, on to Kathryn Wendell. Kathryn, last night, I don't know if you had a chance to hear Rose Marcario, the former CEO of Patagonia. She said last evening that if we stopped right now all innovation, we already have all the tools and all of the technology required to curb the climate crisis. What we don't have is investment. Please tell us about the business sector in the climate realm.
Thanks, Heidi. Hopefully this is working. Okay, great. So it's an honor to be here. I'm here to share kind of a big picture business perspective on all of this. So almost exactly 20 years ago, I started out my career as a Peace Corps volunteer in Ecuador. And people in my Peace Corps community in the Andes Mountains were anxious about the future. They pointed out how the nearby glaciers on volcanoes like Cotopaxi, which was right next to my community, were melting. And there was less water available for agriculture and other economic activities. So very early in my career, I became aware of the moral case for climate action. It's the right thing to do for reasons Jonathan just outlined. My Peace Corps experience inspired me to transition into the private sector, where I worked on corporate social responsibility projects around the world for many years. As everyone knows, business plays a key role in climate change. Most of the emissions causing climate change come from business. At the same time, as Heidi just mentioned, business can drive innovation and investments and solutions at scale in a really exciting way. And I feel encouraged by how the private sector has stepped up and taken responsibility since 2017, when then President Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement. And this is because, in addition to the moral case and the sense of responsibility among some business leaders, there's now a strong business and a strong economic case for taking climate action. And I'm going to summarize the business case really quickly here in 4 points. First of all, climate risk is financial risk. It's material financial risk that can affect the shareholder return over the long term. Second, youth care deeply about climate and equity. And these youth represent key consumers and employees, so businesses are paying attention. Third, there's a lot of money to be made in the energy transition. There's a lot of strategic opportunity, and this is spurring investments at significant scale. And then the flip side, if you look at the economic cost of inaction on climate, it's really high. Deloitte came out with a report in late 2022 that estimated that more than $100 trillion would be lost if we don't take climate action, and that's over the next 50 years. So here are some examples of how the private sector has stepped up to the challenge. More than 4,800 companies have made climate commitments, according to Science Based Targets Initiative. In terms of the largest players, over 40% of the Fortune Global 500 companies have a net zero target and have delivered a milestone. In addition, the private sector is investing significantly in low carbon technology. Climate tech is huge, representing about $80 billion in investments just in 2022. And I can't tell you how many students at the Leeds School of Business, where I work here on campus, have approached me recently asking, how do we get into climate tech? So I think that's exciting. Let's talk about the challenges and what more needs to be done. So there are two groups of companies, right? There's the 40% of Fortune Global 500 companies that have net zero commitments and have met a milestone. What do they need? They need ways to measure and manage their Scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 emissions pertain to the value chain, so these are emissions that are associated with how your product is being used and other things. So they need ways to measure that. They also need technological innovation around carbon sequestration and other technologies. And they need a workforce with broad sustainability knowledge and skills. So now let's talk about the 60%, and this is a lot, 60% of Fortune Global 500 companies that don't yet have net zero commitments. So what's the challenge? The challenge is getting them to make commitments. And here's where regulation, I think, really can help. There's a proposed rule that the SEC is proposing around climate risk disclosure. That could be a game changer, at least in the United States. One interesting fact is that since 2022, China has had more companies on the Fortune Global 500 list than the United States. So think about all the challenges associated with that. You can go to the Science Based Targets Initiative website and see which companies have commitments and which don't. I always like to empower the audience. You can hold these companies accountable if this is something that is important to you. So one final thought. Back in December at the Right Here, Right Now Summit, and I was honored to be part of that steering committee, I moderated a panel with sustainability leaders from Microsoft, VF Corps, Deloitte, and a local company called McKinstry. And we ended the panel with a discussion about what gives us hope. And it came down to two things, and that includes for me as well. First of all, the young people who care deeply about climate inequity, and then second, the power of innovation. What do we have at CU Boulder? We have lots of passionate young people, and we have lots of innovative research and ideas. At the Leeds School of Business, we have 20 years of experience integrating values-based leadership into the curriculum and into research. And I just, through my center, we just launched a new ESG and sustainability pathway for business students to explore careers in this area. And we're partnering across campus. The business school is working more with engineering around solutions, and hoping to partner more with the public sector and the private sector as well around this. So I just wanted to wrap up by saying, there are a lot of challenges that we still need to address, but I am encouraged by the commitments that are being made, and I'm excited about the potential for more creative public-private partnerships, and I hope this panel can spark action.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. Yeah. I want to give the panel the open invitation to comment on one another's comments and also to ask one another questions, but I'll start you off with we've got some questions coming in. There are a multitude of frameworks that have been addressed by all of you down the line, and there also is the reality of the coordination and cooperation that's required regardless of specific frameworks. How, in your respective realms and knowing who you all are, how do you see those as addressing what Jonathan noted and Ben as well, that are those up to snuff for action, the action that we seek at sufficient speed and scale? Jim?
Yeah, no, sorry, they're not. It's nice we have these initiatives and that our current administration is doing much better than the Trump administration, and that we have this action by Boulder, and some companies are taking some action. But I think, Jonathan, I think, really said this. We're not where we need to be. We're not cutting emissions, putting in place the measures that need to happen for us to reach those science-based targets. Science tells us that we're going to have catastrophic effects. I mean, if we're not already for the climate and for humanity, if we don't keep temperatures from rising less than 1.5 centigrade degrees, and we're not on track for that. We're simply not. I said I wanted to say something about the role of the educational institutions, and including ours. Education has a lot to do with addressing the climate crisis. First, we can help cultivate a culture of awareness of the climate crisis and help motivate students in what we do here on campus. Secondly, we can do the kind of research that we're actually very good at the University of Colorado. But thirdly, we need to do our part in reducing emissions. And the University of Colorado Boulder campus needs to do more. We haven't met our targets so far. We've fallen short, and the extent we have been able to reduce emissions, it's been in significant part to due to the decarbonization of the grid that Excel manages. Or COVID, the benefits from COVID and the reduction of energy usage during COVID. And we don't, Kathryn mentioned Scope 3 emissions. We don't set targets with regard to those, or really measure the bulk of them. And we're not outliers necessarily. Most universities don't. But we want to be a leader. That's what I keep hearing. That's, as a faculty member at this university, that's where I want to be. I want to be at a university that is a leader. And so I want to do everything I can as a faculty member, and I want to encourage all my colleagues and those in power at the university to do more.
I'll start by echoing Jim's point that no, none of these frameworks have taken us where we need to go. But I firmly believe the human rights framework can get us there. The problem is the political will and the implementation. And really, when we're talking about climate change, we're talking about an issue that there just hasn't been follow-through and accountability on. And the way that people everywhere are pursuing accountability is by demanding climate justice and by exercising their rights, including their rights of expression, including their right to access justice by suing governments, businesses, whoever they can to hold them accountable for perpetuating the climate crisis. And you heard a number of the panelists mention science-based targets. We all have a right to science and to benefit from its application. It's under international human rights law. Science-based targets are fundamentally part of a rights-based approach. We need to be following the evidence, and we're not. The last point I want to make for now is about equity. So we've heard a lot, and we hear all the time about different commitments that states, businesses, and other actors are making to reduce their emissions. We hear very infrequently about efforts to operationalize the commitments to equity and justice, to common but differentiated responsibility and respective capacities, which are contained in environmental agreements, including the Paris Agreement, and fundamental to their actual realization of their objectives. Because, as was said earlier, the people who are impacted most are often those least responsible and with very limited resources to address, adapt to, and mitigate climate change. So we need to go beyond talking about what happens sort of in our backyard, in our country, in our local context, to talking about responsibility for addressing a collective crisis and for ensuring that there's a redistribution of knowledge, resources, in order to make whole the people who have been affected by climate change, who have experienced loss and damage as a result of climate change, and to make sure that the technology is available everywhere and accessible to mitigate climate change, to stop the crisis from getting worse, to adapt to it, and to remedy the harms. And so I think when we're talking about human rights, climate commitments, we're talking about, one, there being an obligation to stop the crisis. Two, when taking action to stop the crisis, doing it the right way, doing it the way that benefits the people who have been harmed and holds accountable the people, governments, and institutions that have perpetuated a climate crisis, putting out fake science, making obscene profits, and here we are, 30 years after the international community agreed to stop climate change with emissions rising every year. So we've got to stop it. People can stop it. Lawsuits work. People exercising their speech and freedom of expression works. People coming together and exercising choice work. But we need to activate and empower people. And that's what we hope the human rights and climate commitments can help do, to help hold duty bearers accountable and help people understand how they can work together to hold duty bearers accountable to address this crisis.
Thanks, Ben. Congressman, I forewarned everybody that you are at the end of your time with us. And so I want to turn to you, if I could, and ask a student question and then give you a chance as well to offer any final remarks, words of inspiration as you're off to your next. The question from the student is, please, Can we call the IRA a climate bill when it still promises subsidies to oil and gas?
It's a good question. A couple things I'd say. So the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, obviously is a compromise bill. It required making a variety of different concessions to ultimately get that bill across the finish line to President Biden's desk for his signature. There was a larger bill, the Build Back Better proposal that the president had proposed and that I was a strong supporter of and had worked to try to get to his desk, but unfortunately, that was simply not in the cards. All that being said, I think unquestionably the Inflation Reduction Act is a climate bill. If you begin to peel back the various investments that are made in that bill, you will find very quickly that it is going to have an impact in terms of our climate for generations to come. Just to give you a couple of quick examples. The extension of the PTC and the ITC, the production tax credit and the investment tax credit for wind and for solar, a new clean energy tax credit that is not technology specific. So ultimately, we know will help incentivize some of the development around energy storage, which really is the key, in my view, and I think in the view of others, to unlocking sort of this renewable energy future. A $250 billion fund in the Department of Energy to make further investments on the R&D side. A $27 billion fund as it relates to greenhouse gas reductions for local governments and, again, at the subnational level for states like Colorado to continue doing the work that it is doing. To say nothing of the direct investments in terms of rebate programs for each and every American to electrify their homes, vehicle purchases. That, again, is just sort of the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the various investments that are made in the Inflation Reduction Act, and it's why most empirical studies indicate that the bill, when fully implemented, will reduce emissions below 2005 levels somewhere between 31 to 44%. Is that enough? No, we've got to do more. It is a building block. It gives us the opportunity to, progress is iterative, I think, as I heard one of my fellow panelists say, and I certainly agree with that premise. And so I think we have opportunities to build on what we did in this bill. But it also is important to recognize that these are generational investments that we have been fighting for. I say we, really, the royal we, collectively, I suspect a lot of folks in this room, have been fighting for decades. And I do think it's going to have a huge impact for years to come. Last thing I would say on this front, I guess I say this with as much humility as I can offer, and that is that I view this in a much less fatalistic way, and perhaps it's because having come off the heels of these negotiations as it relates to the Inflation Reduction Act, seeing that bill now being implemented, being able to travel my incredible district across northwestern Colorado and see the ways in which communities are already beginning to implement this law in their own respective communities, I am optimistic. I actually think that there is never been a better prospect for us to ultimately address the climate crisis than today. Does not mean that we have made the progress that we need to make. Of course not, far from it. But I also worry a bit that, urgency is important, and it's important for all of us to bring that sense of urgency to this work, but that is balanced against also the need to remain optimistic that this is a crisis that we can ultimately solve. I have a 4-year-old daughter. My wife and I are having our second child in 4 weeks or 5 weeks. Yeah, it's usually a good applause line. I don't know, but anyway. But I offer that more in the sense that to the extent that I am deeply invested as I am in my children's futures and wanting to be able to see them live their dreams, I have to believe that this is a problem that we can solve collectively, together, if we apply the appropriate sense of urgency and boldness. And so and if I don't believe that, then I shouldn't be in the line of work that I'm in. So that's my sense of how I'd answer that question.
Thank you. Thanks, Joe. Your staff is
okay.
giving us the hairy eyeball here, so. Yeah.
May I do a follow-up on that?
Yes.
So I completely agree with Congressman Neguse on this. And I actually think that the approach in the Inflation Reduction Act is kind of brilliant, because for decades we've been stuck in a political situation where the framing of climate action was that it was going to be a cost, and that what we needed to do was focus on making dirty energy more expensive through carbon taxes or cap and trade, and it didn't go anywhere politically at the national level. The Inflation Reduction Act, I think, has really reframed climate action in a much more appropriate way, which is about how do we make clean energy cheap, and how do we invest our way out of climate change. That is something that I think people across the country can respond to and participate in. One of the brilliant aspects of the Inflation Reduction Act is where many of the benefits are going. So if you look at which Congress people voted for the IRA, there's an awful lot of red states where there was no support for the IRA, where there are literally billions of dollars of investments going into new renewable projects, battery factories, electric vehicle manufacturing, the technologies that we are going to need to tackle climate change. Those are going to become bread and butter issues in congressional districts around the country. And I think it really has the potential to transform the politics of climate change so that we're not stuck in the sort of back and forth that we've been over the last 3 decades in this country. The one other thing that I think has been an incredible effect of the IRA that I don't think is widely recognized, but is the extent to which it will also enable far more regulatory action by the federal government. You can see this in the draft rules that the EPA just came out with for both light duty and medium and heavy duty vehicles, where they are far more ambitious rules in terms of GHG emissions reductions and electric vehicle adoption than I think anybody could have conceived as possible 2 years ago. A big part of that is because of both the legal footing that those rules have gotten from the Inflation Reduction Act and the fact that those investments are making it possible to go much further in an economically viable way, so that then allows you to adopt stronger regulatory actions. I think we're going to see something very similar in the power sector, and it's going to be, I believe, far more transformative than is obvious simply by looking, for instance, at the Congressional Budget Office analysis of the impact of the IRA. I think it was one of the more brilliant pieces of climate legislation that we've seen in any country in the world.
Certainly
So
an
thanks, Joe.
impressive scale, as noted. And I can't help myself to ask before the Congressman slips away, and based on what you said, Will, you noted that you want to make clean energy less expensive. Is there any consideration? Rose Marcario, again last night, talked about the fact that fossil fuels were subsidized in this country to the tune of over $22 billion last year alone. Any thought toward removal of subsidies for the fossil fuel feast?
Yeah, look, I mean, there was a rigorous and robust debate within the Congress about repealing a wide variety of some of those subsidies, intangible drilling, tax credits, and all the like. As I said, at the end of the day, any measure that needs to get through the Congress is going to have 218 votes in the House, and in this case, with the budget reconciliation measure, 51 votes in the Senate. I think Will summarized this really well, articulated kind of the policy debate, but from my perspective, to the extent that you enable the free market to thrive, you will see renewable energies ultimately, as Will explained, be far more cost competitive. And so obviously I stand in a certain way on that policy debate, but that's a policy debate that I suspect we're going to continue to have as a country and again at the subnational level within a variety of different states, although really it's more at the federal level as it relates to those subsidies. That's my sense.
You want to comment on that, Will? Nope. All right, fair enough. Well, I think, if I may, we have a number of questions, and it's probably time for us to segue to some of those, if I may, for the panel. From a student, if the climate is an emergency, we should be willing to make compromises to get the job done. What compromises should progressive politicians and governments, who often lead climate policies, be willing to make?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I don't know, we don't want to identify which students are asking which question, but it'd be wonderful to have a conversation between the student who posed the first question and the student who posed this one, right? I mean, fundamentally, this is kind of the challenge that we collectively have to address, and I think the Inflation Reduction Act is a good example for all the reasons that Will described of the necessary compromises that at the end of the day will, in the aggregate, drastically reduce our country's emissions, enable us to make progress and take a giant step forward. So that would be one example.
Anyone else want to? Ben, in the international realm, Jim?
Well, I would just say, yeah, I appreciate the comments of Congressman Neguse, who I deeply respect, and I think he's very artfully shown us the kind of compromises that alluded to, the kind of compromises that need to be made and can be made. I would also add that I do acknowledge how significant the IRA is and how innovative it is and how it has implanted the seeds of very progressive action down the road. I just don't think we can lose sight of the fact that if we look at what we're on track to do and the kind of emissions we're still producing and the projections for the near and medium future, we're not where we need to be. And we just can't lose sight of that. And along with that, we need to have in mind the point that Ben keeps making, which was the point of this summit that we held last year. That is that climate policy isn't just abstract policy. It's not just about debating what kind of compromises there can be. It is about that. It's about obligations. It's about obligations that governments have related to or arising from their obligations to protect human rights. And it's about the responsibilities that the businesses have. I appreciate the business case in financial terms for taking climate action. But it is a responsibility that businesses have arising from their role related to climate and related to their power. And I think those are the two things that cannot be lost in this discussion. Yes, we can talk about the progress, and I think that's very important. And by nature, those of you who know me know that I am an optimist, and I'm often criticized for my optimism. And I appreciate the progress that's being made at all these levels, and I applaud the companies that are doing this great stuff. I really appreciate the work of Congressman Neguse and others who have allowed for this bold action, to be unprecedented action we've taken. But we cannot lose sight that we are not on track for where we need to be at the national, subnational level, and not at the level of the university, as I tried to emphasize earlier.
And if I could just add, I think the question of compromise, I mean, look, we need to do whatever we can to make a dent in stopping climate change. But there is no compromising on human rights. All people have human rights, and their rights must be respected. And there's no compromising with science and with reality. And the reality is that, the crisis we're in is headed towards irreversible tipping points. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the gold standard scientific authority bringing together all of the work done over the last 9 years in its 6th assessment report, made it very clear that we are almost out of time to keep climate change below 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Thank you.
I think it's great for everybody to engage and exercise their speech, but it is true. The IPCC, I attended the negotiations.
Ma'am, if you could, please, thank you.
Well, if you could please have different points of view and different scientific...
Glad to do that. Yeah.
Points of view of reality, ma'am.
Okay.
No comments from the audience. If you have a question, we're happy to take a card. All my questions have not been addressed. Well, there's not. Let's get them in. What happens to free speech? Where's free speech?
It's okay. The format. Carry on, Ben, and thank you.
So, as I was saying, the IPCC has been very clear that we have extremely limited time to keep 1.5 alive. And I encourage those of you who are interested to review the sixth assessment report, summary for policymakers. And
Listen to you, man. We came for the panel.
Ma'am, we offered the format at the outset. If we could adhere to that. No, the First Amendment is well and alive, believe me. We hear you, but we're asking your respect for this panel to conclude, and then we would invite you to please come have conversation. Could we please proceed with the panel and then invite you to have the conversation with panelists? Thank you. Ben, did you have a chance to finish?
yeah, thank you very much, Heidi. And happy to carry on conversations later, as suggested.
Wonderful.
I wanted to really make the point that we have limited time. We do have hope. We have the solutions. And the IPCC is also clear on that. The sixth assessment report, which I was referring to, makes it clear that there is a pathway using rights-based approaches, respecting the rights of indigenous peoples, affirming gender equality, ensuring equity and inclusion and participation to keep 1.5 alive. And that's what everything needs to be oriented around for the next years. And it requires immediate, drastic, and transformative action. It's not something that we can really do incrementally anymore. That ship has sailed. And when we talk about compromise, the UNFCCC process is a process of compromise. Every single decision is a consensus-based decision by all member states. And that's one of the reasons it's not moving as quickly as we would like. There are groups of states in the negotiations who continually, for example, protest and have kept out language about the need to phase out fossil fuels. The actual Paris Agreement, the UNFCCC, in every single decision of the Conference of the Parties to the UNFCCC doesn't contain any language on phasing out fossil fuels. It talks about phasing down coal. The rest are kind of ambiguous, right? And that is a compromise. I'm not here to tell you that I think it's a good one. We need to be clear about the problem. And the UN Secretary General is clear about the problem. We heard about subsidies earlier. Guterres has explicitly called for the elimination immediately of fossil fuel subsidies, but to do it in a way that's respectful of people's rights, because that will have impacts on some people's access to heating and fuel for transportation. So we have to think about all of these policies in a way that we address some of the inequities, right? And there may be a necessary redistribution of wealth and of technology and resources in order to achieve our objectives. And that's the hard problem we're faced with and need to move forward. So I commend all the action that's been done. It's just not enough. We have to do more.
Thanks. Go for it.
Thanks, Heidi. I think a wise panelist would let their smarter colleagues just answer the questions, but no one ever accused me of being wise, so I'm going to just jump in with a couple comments here. I know that all of us in this room are pretty familiar with the reference to the UN Conference of Parties and the discussions that go on around climate change. How many of you know that there are 2 other UN conferences that take place? One on biodiversity and one on desertification. The reason that I raise this is I think we're starting to see a fuller picture emerge in terms of the impacts that we are seeing globally. And look, no one should mistake 2.5 or 2 degrees warming a success. So going back to this comment around compromise, there are things that we should not be compromising on, period. And I really want to appreciate and applaud some of the comments of my colleagues here. We will have caused incalculable damage to ecosystems. That is a reality. And so looking to these other conferences, we actually had a delegate go to Montreal for the biodiversity conference and starting to realize that we're starting to become much more literate on roles and responsibilities of levels of government, for example, and how we build a different architecture amongst the private sector, federal government, state government, institutions, local governments, starting to understand those respective roles and connect into those values. We don't need to debate the temperature, the numbers, et cetera. We can talk about values. That's the thing that connects all of us. So that's one of the great things that we're doing at the local level to try to bring forward some of those values-based issues and recognize that we all have a unique role to play. Really, last comment here, we were talking a lot about the IRA. And it's one of the things Heidi and I have talked about, and some other colleagues as well. The other thing that the IRA, I think, has presented is an opportunity to create a different architecture. And that architecture is looking at a whole lot of potential funding coming in one direction. How do we position ourselves as entities to create new alliances, new partnerships, new scalability of solutions that create benefits to everyone at the local, state, regional, et cetera level? So we don't always work together well. Local governments, state, federal, private institutions, academia. The IRA is creating this really interesting opportunity to think about scalability, to think about right sizing, to think about how we build capacity. Because I will tell you, in conversations with my colleagues all around, we're part of all of these great networks, I think there are a lot of cities that are throwing up their hands saying, oh my God, I have no idea what to do about these dollars coming our way. We don't have staff, we don't have capacity, we don't know how, we don't know what we would actually spend these dollars on. I love that your expression right now because yeah, we're like, really, is that a true thing? But it is, and so we are trying to use our capacity in one city to start to reach out and build more coalitions so we are ready and we are creating that value as those dollars start to flow. So those are just some brief comments, thank you.
Please.
First of all, I just wanted to be clear. So I agree. We are not doing enough to address climate change. Definitely, 100% agree. I want to talk about not so much compromises in the private sector, but there's a big shift. And in 1970, Milton Friedman published an article in the New York Times where he stated the social responsibility of business is to generate profits. And you know that had a lot of implications, and it really drove toward this emphasis on quarterly short-term earnings and profitability. And I'd say that there's a shift now. You've probably heard of the B Corp movement. There are a lot of companies, and some companies have revised their articles. Some companies have actually gone so far as to become benefit corporations so that they're not just focused on profitability, but they're focused on profitability and purpose. And that purpose can include, usually does include, some sort of positive social and environmental impact. So that, just in terms of the big picture business perspective, a lot more businesses are moving in that direction than ever before.
I'm gonna, yeah.
I
Will.
just wanted to add one more thing. As I think about sort of at least my work at the state level, I wouldn't focus so much on sort of what is the need to compromise as on how do you take into account the interests of everybody. So as we work to retire all of the coal generation in the state, how do we work with the residents of Craig, Colorado, who are going to lose their major economic driver? I'm proud of the fact that at the same time that the state passed the legislation that was going to accelerate the closure of those plants, we also created the first Office of Just Transition in the nation and are putting some real money behind it and working with utilities to try to bring investment into those communities. But those sorts of issues arise on virtually every issue that we're working on. And when we think about justice, I think part of that thinking about justice has to include what is the impact on workers, what is the impact on communities as we go through this transition. And that sometimes leads to slightly different policy outcomes than if we just said we're only going to focus on how rapidly we can do the transition. So I think that just has to be part of the conversation.
Excellent. There are just an immense array of questions over here from this robust audience. I am going to collapse several of them into two, the first of which is considering if that fossil fuels are produced anywhere, they will be burned somewhere, contributing to the climate crisis. What more can be done, and you've addressed, many of you, some of this, but what more can be done to phase out fossil fuel extraction and production at the state, national, and global levels? Part one on the question. And then we have no fewer than 5 questions essentially advocating for nuclear power. So I put the two of those together and turn to you, the panelists. Will, you're the
I'm
director
happy
of the Energy Office.
to start. So I would say 2 things. I think that the most important thing that we can do to phase out fossil fuels in a way that is politically possible is to eliminate the demand for fossil fuels through widespread electrification. It is not, I think, politically viable to drive up the cost of fossil fuels while at the same time maintaining demand. People will not stand for that. What we have to do is reduce the demand. That then, I think, makes it possible to phase out the production. On the question of nuclear power, I would say from certainly state of Colorado perspective, we're open to it. When we look at what is going to be required to get to zero emissions, it is going to take additional technologies beyond wind, solar, and batteries. We know that wind, solar, and batteries can take us through this decade to that 85% reduction from electricity generation. To get all the way to 100% is going to require what I would describe as clean, firm, always available, available 24-hour, zero carbon electricity generation. And there's a bunch of different potential technologies that could help to fulfill that, including new forms of long-duration storage, like the iron-air batteries that are going to be deployed in Pueblo. There's a potential that what's known as advanced and enhanced geothermal energy could play a really important role. There's a possibility that hydrogen, green hydrogen, burned in combustion turbines could play an important role. And there's certainly a possibility that advanced nuclear could play a role. From a state perspective, we would like to see electric utilities start to incorporate planning for clean, firm generation into their electric resource planning. We don't need it today, but we need to start the learning by doing and moving down the cost curve that's going to be required for any of these technologies to play the role that they're going to need to play to get to 100% clean by 2040.
Thanks, Will. Anybody else?
I mean, I think that we have certain aspects of our lives and our economies right now that are 100% reliant on fossil fuel availability, and we have to change that. And part of changing it starts with stopping continued exploration and incentivizing the transition. So some of the policy choices that have been discussed here already are moving in that direction. But there are citizens engaging in litigation to stop fossil fuel exploration around the world. And that's one really interesting and promising area. There are countries, I won't name countries because it's not a UN diplomatic thing to do, but there are countries that are exploiting fossil fuels that have no need to export fossil fuels in order to make more money because they have enough money and they've made enough money on the exploitation of fossil fuels already. And some of these countries are actually already domestically using renewable energy. So they could very quickly reduce their carbon footprint by stopping or slowing down their exports in a controlled way. Sure, let's not pretend we can stop everything instantly without vast impacts, but we need to stop everything as quickly as possible. And citizens around the world, people around the world, are engaged in that process, really, to stop continued exploration and exploitation. And on nuclear, it's an incredibly complicated issue that we don't have a fully defined policy position on. But what I can say is we don't know what to do with the waste. We don't fully understand the risks. The environmental law has something called the precautionary principle, right? And that basically says, don't do it if you don't understand the risks and if you don't know how to deal with it. And I think it requires, that we apply these principles to thinking about what to do next. So nuclear isn't clean. It doesn't emit greenhouse gas emissions. It creates a new and almost infinitely lasting source of waste that we don't know what to deal with or how to dispose of. And that's a problem, right? And there are other potential solutions out there, and Will referenced many. So I think we should start there.
And thank you. There is such a great array of questions about the rights of nature and regenerative economy and what's the financial cost. They're just wonderful questions, but we have even run out for the last statements of inspiration and hope unless you got 30 seconds or less running down before we thank you for your participation and end this panel as we are at time. Please join me in thanking this distinguished panel. I'm going to make sure that the panelists get all these good questions, each and every one of them. There's some great ones. Thanks, everybody.
Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.